Hello and welcome to Strip Panel Naked. I'm Hass and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff lurking in the pages of some of the best comics. And back in the great age of superheroes, the landscape for storytelling was quite a bit different than it is now, especially with Marvel and DC comics. Much more emphasis was on creating simple tales of good versus bad, making heroic characters that kids could buy into and see as role models. It was all about being larger than life. Then Spider-Man came along and it flipped that somewhat. It gave us some flaws and it made Peter Parker appear both human and superhuman in equal measure. Some of that is the writing of the stories, but a lot of the weight came down to how Ditko framed Spider-Man and Parker in the panels. That went a long way to showing the size of his character. And it's worth mentioning briefly here how much story used to be packed into each issue of a comic. If you take a look at this page here, you've got basically the entire backstory for how Parker becomes Spider-Man. By today's standards, that's insanely quick. And a lot of what these comics did was seemingly sacrifice deeper storytelling for quick thrills and grandiose spectacle. It's not a knock on the stories, but it's more of a comment on how the medium was used back in the day. And when I say sacrifice deeper storytelling, I mean they were never particularly layered, instead packing in lots and lots of plot. Multi-issue stories spanning months and months of publication time were not the norm, and to condense these complete narratives into single issues, some of the minutiae and heavy character development we see in modern superhero books was dropped. Because of that, actually, a lot more of the heavy lifting sat with the artists. It's even more impressive when you consider a lot of these books were written in plot form. That means they weren't broken down by the writer panel by panel, but instead just the overall story was given. Here in Amazing Fantasy number 15 by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, Ditko was creating so much of this narrative, pacing and beats himself. But the thing I really want to focus on in this episode is how Ditko used framing in the panels in a really dynamic way. As I mentioned, there was a sort of inherent simplicity to the stories, and a lot of that comes through in the page design in the issue as well. These are all rectangular panels of varying sizes, often contained and separated into obvious rows. Again, a big part of that is the amount of story attempting to be told, but in that simplicity there is some really fantastic work. And Ditko breaks out of the boundaries of that simple visual to cleverly frame his characters for certain emphasis. You can see it on the very first page of the comic, and this is really quite amazing storytelling. And it's Ditko immediately establishing a narrative idea that he'll draw on time and time again. So Ditko frames things larger and smaller in panels to show distance, which sounds obvious, right? Smaller is further away from the camera or the reader, larger is closer. But with that, he's showing us importance and emotion. You can see here, shunned, Parker is in the background of the frame. He's smaller, you can see his whole body in less space than you can see these characters in 3/4 height. Their body language and posture takes up room, a solid quarter of the panel, whereas Parker is drawn really thin, all to himself. The face of the middle teen is directly across from Parker's drooping head. I talked about this being simplistic storytelling, I said they seemingly do that. Ditko is bringing clever layers to the book, and if you get rid of the speech bubbles here, you know everything about the relationships between these characters. And there's the final great thing about this page, probably the most immediately obvious, that huge shadow with the outline of Spider-Man, much bigger than Parker, spreading out a more heroic pose. All these elements contribute to telling a story through the visuals. As I say, Ditko is working without the benefit of a script with dialogue written, so he's primarily trying to tell a story without relying on that. And it's so prevalent throughout the story, and if you turn the page you can see so much of it in full effect. Again, the words have been removed from the captions and bubbles so you can start to see the story without that in the way. We saw a panel of Parker shunned in the background, so now here's a panel with Parker in the foreground. He's smiling, stretched out, the antithesis of everything we've just seen, and this is the first panel on the next page, our next image. It presents us two sides to this person, his warm home life and how he is on the outside. The panels are bigger too, weighted heavier, giving them a little more importance for Parker. And if we look a little further down, we move from these mid shots of Parker to this panel in the middle right of the page with Flash and Peter. The difference is kind of striking, right? Parker has been replaced as the center of the frame by Thompson, who basically takes up every bit of room that isn't reserved for speech bubbles. Parker is intersected by Flash's arm, his body flailing with these action lines, and it looks pathetic. And Thompson and the girl are drawn inward, looking at each other, similar to the body language of the teens in the previous page, and once again, a hand in the face of Peter. Simple, right? But it works, and that's the important thing. You understand it all in that one panel. The girls with Flash, they're laughing, Peter's in the background. And that's Parker summed up in one panel right there. But another tool used by Ditko was size. He would exaggerate things in panels. If we skip a page ahead, take a look at the size of Parker's hands in the middle left of the page here. As far as anatomy is concerned, they look about right, kind of normal sized. And he gets bitten by this spider and we move one panel right to this. His hand suddenly becomes huge, and if you look at it from a purely realistic point of view, yeah, maybe a moot point in a superhero comic, but it's too big. And look to the right and the hand becomes normal sized again. Everything about it, the size of the wrist is practically as thick as his neck, it's just too much. But it's done intentionally to create a main focal point. Look on the row below and you get him staring at his hands, and again they feel big. The previous panel he holds this one to his head, again normal size around 3/4, but instead if straightened out they'd be bigger in this Hong Kong panel here. So why? I mean, it's clearly purposeful. Ditko knew how to draw hands smaller, obviously, but it's all about effect. Alfred Hitchcock used to use oversized props in his films to make things larger than they normally ever would be, because he wanted them to be key visual points in the frame, and here Ditko is utilising that very same effect. And it swings both ways too, because this framing flips when Parker becomes Spider-Man. You get this panel, Parker in the front of the frame just waist up while the fans are smaller in the background, and that intersection of an arm comes into play again too, but this time it's Spider-Man's. And this dominating size is seen beautifully on the final page of the story too. It opens with this, Spider-Man the whole panel, the villain who killed his uncle trapped between his legs, looking like an ant in comparison. He goes up to Spider-Man's knees, and clearly you can tell he's going to win this fight. And then the final panel, after Spider-Man realizes this is the guy he let get away earlier in the issue, and look how small he's become. Ditko renders him so tiny, not something you normally do for a superhero, especially not at the end of a comic. And this comes after he's already established that small means weak. He's actually smaller in stature than the villain in the first panel of that page was. And I want to stress that though this seems really obvious and simple stuff, it's what made these early Marvel comics feel so dynamic. There's a great moment in How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, where Buscema points out the time to show action by using a man throwing a punch as an example, and their philosophy was all about that, emphasizing visually and action. And Ditko was all about visual storytelling. And back in that time, honestly, you kinda had to be. The writer often was looking through your pages and then deciding what the characters were gonna say to each other. So Ditko had to learn how to tell you a story without words, how to convey basically everything you needed to know visually. It's a strength that's clearly wildly important when it comes to a comic book. And I implore you to go pick up one of these comic books and just cover the dialogue, and see if you can understand the beat-to-beat actions, the storyline going on in each of the pages without any of that. And I can almost guarantee you that you will, that it'll all make sense without even hearing any of these characters talk to each other. And when you look at these stories and assume, like I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, that they are simple, lacking the depth of modern stories, you're missing something vital. The real, tangible skill of an artist like Steve Ditko, who, with every page, used framing, body language, and these exaggerated sizes in such an often understated way that it appeared to be so simple. To make it look this effortless, that takes true mastery. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy Strip Panel Naked and want to see more content, support us on Patreon, where each week there are new reading lists, articles, and annotated page breakdowns. Follow me on Twitter too for a bunch of extra content where I routinely take pages I'm reading and break them down. So see you next time.